All right, so what I'm going to be going through now is Section 3 of the NAWAPA 21 Special Report. Section 3 is based on a restoration of the system of public credit, how this thing worked in the past, how we can do it now today. The United States was founded on a restoration of the system of public credit, in fact, and it's no accident that every time we've fallen through our history into this piggy bank economy mentality that we find ourselves again in today, what's required is a complete rediscovery of exactly how it worked before by a new administration that takes off the shackles that have been imposed upon it and asserts rightful sovereignty over its own finances. But it only works when it follows a certain line of development seen in the administrations of Washington with Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, and Lincoln Franklin Roosevelt. And each of these people have reflected back on the work done by these preceding administrations and have separated out the confusion that comes in during these periods of pure monetary finance, of pure piggy bank mentality. And we'll get into that as we go in this series of now installments that we'll be doing, outlining and elaborating in Section 3, a restoration of the system of public credit and how NAWAPA 21's construction is going to be integrated into that. Essentially, we're at a point now where we can't be abstract about funding some kind of infrastructure project. We can't separate with some kind of credit fund simply as an infrastructure bank and then fund a project. We have to basically reorganize the entire banking system, essentially reviving that system as a complete whole if we're going to direct the nation's intention as a whole, all of its resources, to a future state. We're now strapped. We have broken down financial systems. The states are bankrupt, as everybody knows, cutting this, cutting that, as we've seen this whole last few years, targeting different groupings besides the Wall Street speculative groups, besides the global mortgage-backed securities system. Instead, policemen, firemen, the states have to start cutting, and then now we have this mentality in the federal government that the budget itself, this fixed amount, this year to year, has to just be decreased. Rather, what we have to do is we have to realize it's the tying up of the government's intent with future wealth, which is actually the chief source of any shall we say, fiscal responsibility. In fact, the creation of new debt for this future wealth is actually not a problem. So, although we do want to extinguish the debt, the valid debts, after we initiate Glass-Steagall, the actual understanding of the meaning of debt and the value of debt is not a self-evident question. It's tied into how is the financial system organized by a sovereign government, and how does it use a credit fund institution in collaboration with all of its collected taxes and any kind of financial assets that it has. So essentially, what we're going to be going through now, I'm just going to give you an overview of how this process is going to work, and then we'll come in with exactly how Hamilton did it. And it's outlined there for you in the report. Essentially, as I said right now, the chief concern is the restoration of the system of public credit so that credit can be a source for investment, so that we have a strong currency and that this currency is now something that people want to invest in as a long-term investment, not this quick speculative money-making things. What we have to do, a certain few steps and phases as this is going to work itself out. Phase 1. What has to be done before anything else is, again, cutting off our commitments to these crazy financial institutions that have been set up as the measure and the standard of profit, but in fact, as many people have demonstrated in various films and so forth over the last few years, has a quite duplicitous backdoor operation behavior, to say the least. AIG, other kind of money market things, we want to cut off our commitment to that as a Treasury. The Treasury, working with the Fed, the Treasury's commitments to back up the $17 trillion and so forth of foreign bank debt, that commitment and other commitments are hanging as a weight around our neck. What we need to do is have the Treasury's own interests with its own actual valid finances through the actions of the economy, the real economy. It's those considerations and its actual potential resources in collected taxes and so on. Those are how those instruments and associated lending institutions that we're going to set up have to be the chief interest of the Treasury. So what we have to do, something that's going to be very similar to what Franklin Roosevelt did in 1932 with Glass-Steagall, if not exactly the same. We'll have some kind of bank holiday. It may take longer than a month. During this process, we'll be able to do a number of things simultaneously here with Phase 1. And so I can say in this Phase 1 period, what we'll be doing is we'll be immediately separating out this fictitious debt, figuring out what our actual assets are, taking a thing where we do an assessment of the municipal and state debts, and we bring them into the responsibility of the national government. That's an action. We immediately cut off the ability for more printing by the Fed for the purposes of buying mortgage-backed securities and U.S. government securities. Essentially, what they have an asset book, right, of what their so-called assets, and they print this money based on bringing in new assets and printing money to buy these things. That's going to be frozen, right? We'll just take that action. We'll say no more. You cannot increase that asset book. It's a bankrupt leverage institution, and it's involved in lots of wild financial instruments. It's lending to other private banks. It's not lending as a national bank lent and was set up for the economy and actual government operations toward the economy and its affairs. And we'll outline this more in detail later. So a restoration of the Treasury's control over its finances will be done. But it will be linked to then in Phase 2, we're going to, once we take these actions, establish some kind of credit fund. When I say the credit fund, I mean a fund for circulating credit, which is what Hamilton defines in his works, and how he set up the original national bank with Robert Morris, is essentially we're looking at a fund for circulating credit, which has various degrees. And the reason I use that term is so you understand the difference between the Franklin Roosevelt credit funds and the national bank, and realize that as we add certain qualities to this institution, which is a tool of the government, we have different names and qualities to it. That brings us from an RFC, which is a special institution that receives marketed bonds by the Treasury, its own bonds, but marketed by the Treasury, for instance, most of it was done, and loans, these long-term loans, it does its own sale of bonds that are backed up by the credit of the United States. The Treasury's committed. It was the same with the Tennessee Valley Authority, right? These were bonds that were essentially people were investing in the long-term construction of the country, and everybody would love to do that right now. Everybody wants some kind of long-term security in the actual future of the country. This is one quality: a long-term lending institution with some kind of special sum from the Treasury or associated fund that's organized and backed up by the Treasury. Now, if we make this thing, if we give it the ability to have the depository of all government taxes, the budget year, the resources of the country can be constantly in action through the lending of this national institution, a national bank, a fund. Now, if we allow not just the government taxes to be lent out in the period in which they're not necessary for allocation, and what Abraham Lincoln said, okay, rather than these things sitting in iron boxes, as what happened with the Jackson situation, we'll go into that more later. Now these funds are constantly in operation and affecting the intent of the government as a resource. But also, if we say that this bank will have a capital stock that includes essentially anyone who holds U.S. government debt, or we bring in these newly assessed debts through the Glass-Steagall process, now what we're going to be doing is turning these monetary debts, these state municipal debts that are now just hanging around the necks of all these states, so they can invest in the future. They're paying interest. They're trying to turn over all these terrible debts. If we take these monetary debts now and we put them into this capital stock of a new national bank institution, we will be able to tie those debts now to long-term credit lending. This will turn these monetary debts into an actual source of value with the intent to make good upon it. This is actually now turning from monetary debt into a credit debt. We'll tie the value of these newly assessed debts after Glass-Steagall to the long-term development of the economy. All right, so phase 2, once we take these other actions, which the specifics will be worked out, we will then assess what will be new revenues coming in around the country for the Treasury, to then, in collaboration with the credit fund, figure out how to essentially make good upon any assessed valid debts over the course of the coming generation without cutting. And we'll see that Hamilton had the exactly same intent and execution of his system. Protective tariffs. The intention of the United States to re-achieve some kind of ability to produce its own pumping systems for water. That would be nice. Hydroelectric equipment, massive heavy earth moving equipment industries. We have some of them. But the ability to have our own sovereign capability to manufacture these things in the United States. This is a national security issue. It could be done simply from that reason. Many reasons we look at, we say we, as the United States, have an interest in having these industries here producing our own necessary manufactured goods, steel, rail systems, our foundries, all of these kinds of manufacturing industries and material production industries, which used to be the basis for investing in new technologies for things like the space program, the creation of steel alloys that had never ever been done, temperatures that had never been achieved. A long-term investment in our industries where the workers themselves are contributing because they know they have a long-term security at a job, and we develop these industries over a generation, they pick up qualities which you can't just get by moving a factory somewhere overseas and paying cheap labor. That's the most important part of the process. But the tariffs that we're going to reapply now for the construction of NAWAPA 21, what will be necessary, will assess the fact that this will now be a new revenue for the government. We're looking at the part of the process by once we decide we're going to build this project and restore our capability as a nation to make something happen, which is the real meaning of credit. Can you make something happen? Are you good for your word in completing the project? If you are, now you can have a system in which there will be an assurance that an investment is completed. What's also necessary is the restoration of the fixed exchange rate system in order that a currency can be invested in for long term. And this will be also part of the whole system that we'll set up. But we'll go into that more later. Tariffs, an increase in general economic activity can be expected as soon as we set into motion the commitment to do this project by the collaboration of the governments of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Even the preliminary design and study will begin to kick certain industries into motion. But once it's committed, we will see a general increase in economic activity, which will also be a source of revenue with taxes and the various taxes that can be done on manufacturing, domestic excise taxes. People can figure out how these will be beneficial both for the Treasury and for the project construction as a whole. Various incentives, various things like that. We'll outline more in detail, and you can see in Appendix 2 exactly the different revenues that are possible. But things as also the sale of water, how agriculture and industry will be using this water is going to increase economic activity. Land values increasing will bring in new tax receipts for the three governments. And now what we'll be doing is taking what are currently these stopgap, say, infrastructure, transportation bills and so on that are not actually going to make things more efficient, simply put off how much we can cut at one it's trying to cut as much as we can, putting off the inevitable. We will be now, the Treasury will be, instead of having to take annual budget revenues, sinking into these and patching holes, we can incorporate the infrastructure projects into more of this long-term lending institution, and try and work something out with the National Bank or this credit fund like the RFC, and figure out how to make things that are actually long-term a responsibility of that institution, something that's aided by that institution, and have the annual budget, something separate. The amount of lending that is going to be done will be estimated in this Phase 2 process also by figuring out how much we can put into motion at one given time. We look at the needs, the requirements of NAWAPA 21 as defined in Section 3. In Section 1. At the end of Section 1, what we have is an investment analysis. And in that, we look at the fact that we're going to have to be working, the NAWAPA 21 authority, we're going to have to be working with certain government agencies, probably the Treasury, figuring out how, based on analysis of our own industries and plants capacity and labor groups, how much we can expect in a given amount of time, the scheduling of the project, what the phases are going to be, ensuring the fact that we develop the skills and industries and so forth to meet the different phase requirements, designing in future technologies so when we get to a later phase, we're ready to complete a big investment. How we allocate that is going to be tied up with essentially, therefore, how much lending will be going on by the National Bank or other institution that we set up. And this will be, therefore, emitted and committed by the U.S. government based on expected completion times and so forth. And that is essentially the real metric for how the credit system needs to work, which is that its productivity is your measurement for essentially how much you can the government commit to and make good upon. So you have to be looking at a correct analysis of what you can achieve with a technology and so forth. All right, so Phase 3. Once we have initiated Glass-Steagall, reassessed the valid debts and assets that we're committed to, now we then can expect, with a credit institution, we have the system in which we can intend to build this project, and we can look at all of the regulations, the revenues that I just discussed. Once those revenues are assessed, now we can say we're going to be channeling those things into the funding of the debt. The funding of the debt is how can we say, according to our interests as a sovereign nation, achieve a timetable of making good upon that debt, giving that debt the value that it should have so that it can circulate as currency. And we'll see again in the history how that worked under Hamilton. So these new assessed, as I said, we'll be linking these these old monetary debts, we're turning them into credit debts, we'll be linking them to the specific timetable of NAWAPA. We'll figure out exactly how we're going to fund these new debts assumed as the national responsibility of the United States and worked out with some kind of essentially collaboration with this credit fund. So rather than pay these debts by just cuts, which is impossible, we'll be turning these into a credit source, and people will be investing into the long-term purpose to which the debt will be associated. And this is Hamilton's maxim about creating a debt or assuming a debt and allocating the resources, channeling them in the same act. So this will all be based on the specific timetable of NAWAPA 21 and exactly what we end up determining as the capital stock of the National Bank will therefore be tied in with the productivity of NAWAPA 21 and how we actualize the various forms of debt. So essentially, it's going to be a process that has to be worked out exactly how it's done. But the main thing is this maxim of Hamilton, which is the creation of the debt and the funding of the debt are one and the same act. So the real question is essentially not one of just purely how you reorganize the financial system, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, create some kind of new form of money or so forth. The real question is the intention of the government to use these different means toward building something. And how the intention of the government ends up working itself out is one of convenience and one of just how every time it's going to be different. Every administration that's done is different. The intention is what is the same, the invariant through the decision to start building. Now, this last phase will also include, therefore, the specific financing of NAWAPA 21. And as I say, an estimate of requirements in a given amount of time will be integrated into part of this whole credit system, and we'll figure out exactly how the specific lending will work out. And that's descending into a bit of detail, but it's important to lay this out. And we put this in Appendix 2 of the report, the specific steps, which may be an echo of how the TVA authority was done, but this would be for 3 nations, and essentially how these bond issues and various relations with the credit fund may work. And this is something that we can work out in more detail later. But essentially the main point is that a finished plan, a legislative plan, a finished plan worked out by the various experts of the United States who study this arc and are committed to this arc of history that is laid out here, will be the basis to return to the credit system. And NAWAPA 21 itself, although it is a massive continental project which is going to put the entire country into motion, that itself will still be one component of an entire system that we are going to build. But it can be the basis as an example of how we go about this as a proper government should in funding this large continental public works project for restoring the system as a whole. So what we're going to be going into next is how Alexander Hamilton did this, how he set up the system, what we was faced with, and the terms that I've discussed here should become more clear in looking at the different steps that he took to set up the system of public credit as he defined it.